Okay, this is week two podcast. We talked this time about state constitutions and federalism, chapter two and chapter three. So let's get started with this. The first question is how do state constitutions differ from the national constitution? Well, I listed a number of characteristics of state constitutions here, and I'll talk about them. First of all, state constitutions are longer. They're much longer. Some of them are two, three, and four times as long as the national constitution. Many of them. The reason for that is because state constitutions, when writing state constitutions, the founding fathers of individual states were more likely to put a lot of detail in, um, avoiding kind of the ambiguity and limitations of the national constitution because they were afraid, like for example, a classic example would be taxes. They were very much afraid that the legislature would increase a lot of taxes, given the power to tax. So they would put in the state constitution limitations like you can't pass a new tax unless you get the approval of the voters. So you have to have a special election. We just did that here in Santa Fe. That's not the state level, but at the local level, we did that with the soda tax. They wanted to raise the or put a tax on all sugared beverages to discourage obesity. And in order to do that, they had to have a special election. So state constitutions have the same kind of thing, where they would say something like you can't tax the people unless you get their approval. So that's one of the things that makes it longer. There's other things too. We'll talk about some of those as we go along here. They contain specific laws. That's a kind of strange thing. The national constitution, if it were to be a model, it would suggest that you never put specific laws in there. But oftentimes, what they're talking about when they talk about specific laws, what they're talking about is there's oftentimes benefits that, to special interest groups. Like a classic example would be farmers, that you would put in things like farmers would be entitled to a certain amount of money if the crops don't come in, and if there's problems with them making a profit, you would do things that would be beneficial to them so that they could make money and stay in business. So you see that with all kinds of interest groups, not just farmers, but lawyers and doctors and everybody who lobbies the legislature, state legislature, to try to get special benefits, and they write it right into the law. Um, anyway, you'll see that if you read a state constitution, and you're going to have to do that with some of the assignments, or one of the assignments at least. You'll see specific laws in state constitutions, and you don't have anything like that at the national level. It's the opposite at the national level, where there's very little written. It's a very short constitution, and it says very little about much of anything. And that causes a lot of confusion too. A lot of people think it's better to leave it very ambiguous, like we do at the national level, but it isn't necessarily a good thing, because we never really understand what the intention of the founders were. Like a classic example would be impeachment. Yeah, a president these days can be impeached for almost anything, and because the Constitution says you can be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors, and nobody really knows what that means. There's a lot of speculation about what it means. Misdemeanors didn't mean like jaywalking or getting a ticket, traffic ticket or something like that we would think of today. Um, but anyway, it's too ambiguous, and a lot of the Constitution is like that. That's why the president and Congress in particular, or the president mostly, have just kind of taken over and set up a kind of presidency-centered government where the president is making the law. without much constitutional limitation. You have, for example, in the first 100 days of President Trump, and I have a hard time saying that, but in the first 100 days of President Trump, most of what he did was executive orders. Now, I'm sure that the founding fathers had no intention that the president of the United States, and Trump isn't the first one, Obama did the same kind of thing, pass a whole bunch of executive orders. They wouldn't want that. They would expect that Congress would pass laws. But the president can't get Congress to pass the laws, so he just does executive orders, and that's sort of the equivalent of a law. It's not as broad and all-consuming as a law would be, but it's what he does these days. Anyway, going back to state constitutions, they contain specific laws which, in general, are benefits to interest groups. Another change or difference is it's harder to amend. Well, it's hard to amend any constitution, really, national or state, but usually the state ones are harder. Anytime you require a extraordinary majority, anything more than 50% plus one, it's hard, and that's almost always the case at the state level more than at the national level, although both are difficult. We don't see that many amendments anywhere. Less flexible, that is, the states are less flexible in their constitutions. What happens here, when you say less flexible, what we're saying is that they're very much more specific. For example, they might say something like, no judge can make more than, at the state level, can make more than, say, $100,000 a year. And then you get to a certain point in history, and that doesn't seem like a lot of money. Maybe when they wrote the regulation into the Constitution, it was good. Most constitutional experts would say you should leave that kind of specific out because it makes it very unflexible. The only way you can change the Constitution then is to write a new Constitution or amend the Constitution, both of which are very difficult to achieve. So at the national level, it's very, very flexible because it doesn't say anything. And so the Supreme Court, the President, the Congress can pretty much do whatever they want to do, whatever comes up. It's not going to be specifically stated in the Constitution. And then the last thing is that the U.S. Constitution is both written and unwritten. There's the practice of the Constitution. There's what's in the Constitution, what the Constitution says, and then there's the practice of the Constitution. And the practice of the Constitution, which is the unwritten Constitution, is basically what the President, Congress, and the Supreme Court do, which are not in the Constitution, which are not specifically part of the words. And then that becomes part of the Constitution because that's the practice. For example, what I just mentioned, which was executive orders of the President, the extensive use of executive orders became a practice because the President couldn't get his will through Congress. So he began to do this executive order stuff. And you could see it especially during the Clinton administration and then the Obama administration and now in the Trump administration. So when the President does that, then it becomes the practice. So if President Clinton did it, then Obama feels comfortable doing it and so on. So anyway, that's part of the unwritten Constitution. Pretty much the Supreme Court doesn't have any real good guidelines from the National Constitution because the National Constitution doesn't really say much about the problems that we face. Like, for example, when we were, after 9/11, when we were involved in the war, the two wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the administration, because they were so upset about everything that happened, were willing to take on things like uh, torture and willing to torture people and extraditions and all kinds of things that were, really uh, never in the Constitution. And the Supreme Court had to respond to that. And, what they do is they just kind of make it up. Um, Probably another classic example would be Roe versus Wade, the abortion. Naturally, a Constitution that's 250 years old doesn't talk about abortion. So, again, they have to make it up. And then that becomes the unwritten Constitution. So there's a great deal of flexibility as a result of the ambiguity of the language at the national level and a great deal of unwritten activity that become part of the Constitution at the national level to make it useful in the 21st century when, that thing was written at a time that wouldn't make any sense to us living in our time. And the state is kind of the opposite of that. It goes essentially by a written constitution that's not very flexible, that has to be amended or rewritten, and as a result, what you get is at the state level, there's a lot of rewriting constitutions. They don't last 200 years. Okay. Wait a minute, what happened here? Second question is, what are the arguments for and against term limits? I didn't put the number down here. So here you have it. This is the arguments for and against. 4 term limits are on the left, and then on the right are against term limits. So here's the arguments in favor of term limits. Term limits mean that after a certain number of times that you're serving in office, usually about 6 to 10 years, you have to quit regardless. And these are the arguments that are in favor of that. Many people, incumbents particularly, are able to get reelected with not doing their job, not doing much of anything. Look at Congress. They have so much of a problem of the Democrats and the Republicans working together to solve the issues. They talk about it during the campaigns, and then when they get elected, they don't do anything. So people, they don't solve our problems. They don't really pass meaningful legislation. So the end result is that there's a feeling that they should be kicked out because they're not doing their job. Another thing is that incumbents have an unfair advantage. The sense is that incumbents are fundraising all the time. Actually, as soon as they're elected, they start going to these rubber chicken dinners back home. As a matter of fact, if you look at Congress, and term limits are really kind of were first designed with Congress in mind. It's not so much at the state level that they would do all these things, but they do. It's not to the same degree, but they do the same things, I should say. So incumbents, they're always raising money, and it's easier for them to raise money because they're in power, and interest groups want to influence them, and so you see them raising a whole lot of money. For example, almost anywhere where they put in gambling, whether that's a lottery or casino gambling or whatever, the gambling interest, the lobbyists for the gambling interest have a lot of money, and they gave a lot of money. Almost every state that you initiated the beginning of it, like if you go to Illinois and look at when they started casino gambling, they made members of the state legislature rich by giving them all kinds of contributions to their campaigns. So the argument is you can't beat an incumbent because they raise so much money, and they're able to be, to have interest groups more likely to give them money because they won already. Again, the same thing which I've said here, and then the third one, big money goes to the incumbents. That happens all the time. Senators and representatives it's just simply it's easier for them to get money. If you're on the outs, it's hard. Interest groups will be less influential. The argument is that if members of the legislature are limited in their experience, that the interest groups will be able to influence them more. I'm not sure how good that argument is, but anyway, that's what they say. Another one is that they're less likely to have we're less likely to have career politicians, and the people who are in favor of term limits don't like the idea of career politicians. They want us to have sort of citizen politicians. That is, people come to the legislature, stay there for a few years with ideas, and then leave, rather than have career politicians, because the argument is that career politicians cost you more. You have to give them benefits and all of that, like pay for their medical and give them salaries and raise their salaries in order to keep them there and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, the argument is that we don't need career politicians. We should look upon, or politicians should look upon, public service as volunteering, like doing community service or something like that, where you're just a volunteer. You're not there to make money. You're just there to help out your fellow citizens. And then the last one is that there's less chance for corruption. The argument again is that if you're not entrenched, if you're not a longtime politician, you're not as likely to get corrupted. I don't know about that one either, but anyway, that's what they say. Coming from Illinois and then coming to New Mexico, where corruption is about as common as it is in Illinois, I don't know if any of that would matter. I think the biggest thing that happens with corruption is that the public isn't aware and the media isn't doing their job to see what the politicians are doing. That's biggest part of the problem that brings about that corruption. But anyway, I'll leave that. Just keep in mind those are the arguments for term limits. Against term limits are these. You kick out good legislators. Why should people have to quit if they're good? The second thing is that experience makes experts. That is, the longer you're there, the more likely you are to become an expert in whatever field you deal with in your committees. Like, for example, if you're on the education committee or the farm committee or something like that, whatever it is, you become knowledgeable about how to do the job. There's no place you go to get educated. It's something that you learn from experience, and if you're going to kick people out after a certain number of years, that means they're not going to be as expert as they would if you let them stay. Number 3, they know how to get things done. The longer you're there, politics is all about compromise, and the more you're there, the longer you're there, the more likely you are to make friends with the other party and members of the other party, and more likely to really try to accomplish things together. Number 4, if public wants to keep electing certain people, they should have the right. The argument is that in a democracy, you should have a right to vote for whoever you want, and if you want to keep somebody in office, you should have that right. They shouldn't. It's sort of undemocratic to make them quit. The fact that it's argued that they don't do anything, they're not doing their job, on the other side, is exaggerated, is the argument. That's overstated, that the legislature does get some things done. It might look like they're always fighting, but they do get some things done. That's what's said. Anyway, those are the arguments for on the left and against term limits on the right. Number 3, what are the criticisms of federalism? Okay, these are what I came up with. Number 1 is they prevent national policy. That's a really big one, that if you have the states, and keep in mind that what federalism is it divides power between the national government and the states and gives the states a lot of power. Mostly what you could kind of think about is that it gives the states a veto power over national policy. And that is to say, if a state wants to do something other than what the national government wants, they can usually get away with doing that. So you almost never have a national policy. First of all, it's very hard to get national policies. So, a lot of people, like with something like gun control, every time there's a major assassination or shooting at a school or something like that, people call for national gun control laws. And you really don't have a national gun control law because um, every state's different and every state has a right to pass its own laws. And so if you come out here, like out in the West, um, it's, guns are pretty prevalent and it's okay for people to have guns. That's been the history of the West and the Southwest. So, no national gun laws would really work in the culture of guns that you have here. It leads to a lack of accountability. There's so many different governments. One of the things that federalism does is it gives you governments at all three levels. The national, state, and local are all independent of each other in a sense. The Constitution only calls for separation between the national government and the states, giving independence to both entities, the national entity and the state. But over time, again, part of the unwritten Constitution is that local government is in that picture too. So you've got three levels. And so people don't know who's responsible for just about anything. I mean, after all, all three levels of government are taxing, all three levels of government are passing laws, all three levels of government are enforcing laws. And you don't even know who has responsibility for something. I mean, governments argue over it. Like if there's a crime has been committed, oftentimes you'll see the national government there, that is the FBI, police department will be there, and the state police will be there, and the local police will be there. And it's confusing. And it's very confusing to the public all the time about who has responsibility for any particular function. Probably once you get beyond foreign policy, we all kind of understand that the national government is responsible for going to war and raising an army and that kind of thing. But beyond that, when you get to domestic policy, all three levels are intermingled doing the same things. They're all in education, they're all in welfare and so on. And so the public doesn't understand how this works. And it's a very confusing system to begin with, complicated system because there's so many governments and so many layers of government. Number three, as I just said, that it's too difficult for the public to understand. Accountability isn't there because, everybody blames everybody else. If there's a problem like you had Katrina, all three levels of government were blaming each other. New Orleans, the state of Louisiana, and the national government all blaming each other. And so the public is confused, who is really responsible here. And it's difficult to understand, when you have all this kind of thing. Even, like the people try to simplify it all, especially during campaigns where, presidential candidates walk around saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Governors, mayors, they all do the same thing. And that's confusing to the public because they think these people have real power when really what they're doing in a federal system is they're sharing power, not only with the other branches that they have as part of their government, but they're sharing power with the states and local government, that is the national sharing power with the states and with the local governments as well. So a president or a governor or anybody walking around saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, is really deceiving the public. And no wonder they don't understand how it works. Another thing is it fosters state loyalties over national loyalties. So you see a lot of that, people saying, if you ask people where you're from, there's a lot of people who say, I'm from Illinois, or I'm from New Mexico, or wherever, and kind of taking a pride in that, as opposed to saying, just a U.S. citizen. The only time people are going to say that is if they're in a foreign country. But there is a loyalty at the state level and at the local level that wouldn't exist if you didn't have federalism. And then the last one, criticism, is that there's too much diversity in the laws from state to state. Particularly, I would say, when it comes to delivery of services, there is marked differences. I said this before in the first week, but there is a real unevenness in the delivery of services. One of the things that I notice here, moving to New Mexico, is that the educational system is not nearly as good as it was in Illinois. That is, the public school system is not nearly as good. It's smaller, of course. It's probably not fair to compare it to Illinois or Chicago when it comes to public schools. But in fact, what it boils down to is that they don't have nearly as much money here. And because they don't have much money, they wind up not paying the teachers as much as you would get in a more prosperous state like Illinois. And students come to the classroom, public school classroom, in poverty, and all the problems that are associated with that become part of the picture. As a result, we are always on the bottom of those standardized tests. Believe it or not, New Mexico is just about at the bottom of any, like math test, science test, or anything like that. Is really pretty depressing. Well, anyway, those are the criticisms. You see a lot of that diversity in the law. Some places it's very good. Some places it's not. There's nothing that happened. I mentioned before about, like in Illinois, what an effort they make to clean up the snow. And some places out here in the west and in the south, they don't do anything. They just wait for the sun to melt it. So you just kind of have to stay home if it really snows. Okay, the last one is, how does federalism differ in theory and practice? Well, there's two concepts that you need to know about the theory and then the practice of federalism. In the theory of federalism, there's what we call dual federalism. That is, that the national government, the power in the federal system is divided between the national government and the states. This is kind of what what you'd find if you read the Constitution, the national Constitution. So power is divided between the national government and the states. Like I said, in modern times we developed local as well. But the Constitution just talks about this dual federalism, saying basically that each entity, the national government and the states, are independent of each other, and they have the right to pass laws in their own geography or in their own jurisdiction. And they should be separated. Certain functions are state and local, or state, and certain functions are national. Basically, the Constitution looked at the national government to pass, to be responsible for laws that were in the general good, just laws that were needed by the national government to take care of foreign policy, army, that kind of thing, relationship between with other countries. And then the last thing would be just to settle disputes among the states, so there wouldn't be like riots and fights and Illinois going to battle against Wisconsin or something like that. Instead of doing that, they go to the Supreme Court and argue cases. So that's the idea of a dual federalism. And then the practice of federalism, how it's really developed over time, is what's called cooperative federalism. And that is that instead of really just dividing power and saying, okay, this is the national power and then this is the state power, instead of doing that, we've allowed, through practice, to allow the national government to get involved in everything that the state's involved in, like education and highways and welfare and all those things that were originally designed to be state only, according to the national constitution. So that's kind of the basic nuts and bolts of, um, of federalism. You have a theory of divided power, with most of the power going to the states, and then you have the practice of federalism, which is cooperative federalism, where instead of that you have um, both levels of government, or all three levels of government, national, state, and local, operating on the same domestic things. Foreign policy, yeah, that's still national, but everything else is shared, or that's why it's called cooperative. Cooperative. I'm not sure how cooperative it is, but it's all three levels doing the same things. Okay, I think that should be enough to answer those questions.